It began not with a revelation, but with a question, one whispered through the pages of forgotten journals embedded in crumbling stone and hovering in the static between silence and wonder. What if the story of humanity isn't as linear as we think? What if time doesn't march forward, but spirals, looping back through lost brilliance and buried truths? History as we know it is a carefully edited manuscript. It tells us of steady progress, of primitive beginnings, gradual enlightenment, and a crescendo of modern innovation. But behind the official chapters lie annotations in invisible ink, stories too strange, too disruptive, too magnificent to fit the accepted arc. Throughout the 20th century, a handful of explorers ventured into the world's margins, the polar extremes, jungle depths, desert expanses, and mountain peaks. They weren't chasing legends, they were mapping unknowns, studying ancient art, cataloging rocks and routes. But what they found was something else entirely. Cities under ice, machines carved in stone, star maps older than astronomy, technologies that didn't match the hands or minds credited with their era. These weren't just tales of adventure or misinterpretation. The documents existed, some in private diaries smuggled from classified archives, others in sketches, broken artifacts, half-buried photographs, or in the fading testimonies of those who saw but were told to forget. What bound them together wasn't a single location or civilization, but a shared aftermath, silence, censorship, erasure. In 1947, Admiral Richard E. Byrd described warm valleys in Antarctica where ancient cities shimmered beneath ice-free skies. In 1925, Colonel Percy Fawcett vanished into the Amazon, leaving behind clues of a civilization as structured and populous as any in the classical world. In Tibet, manuscripts detailed knowledge of physics and flight, predating Newton and the Wright brothers. In the Gobi, metallic instruments embedded in stone defied timelines. Again and again, explorers returned with more than what they sought, and were met not with curiosity, but containment. Each of these expeditions, on the surface, told a different story, a mapping mission, a cultural exchange, a search for fossils. But underneath, they echoed the same melody. Discovery followed by doubt, then a door closing before the world could listen. This series follows 14 of these moments, expeditions that found what they shouldn't have. It is not a chronicle of conspiracy, but a meditation on memory and silence. For every artifact hidden, every photograph lost, a question remains. Why are we so afraid of rediscovering our past? Are these accounts real? Some may be misreadings, embellished across time. Others hold records too precise, too inconvenient to dismiss. But the purpose here is not to prove or persuade. It is to listen, to stories buried not just by sand or snow, but by systems too fragile to let them surface. Because sometimes history isn't lost. It's locked away. And every now and then, someone stumbles upon the key. February 19, 1947. Somewhere over Antarctica, Admiral Richard E. Byrd's aircraft cut through a sky washed in polar light. Below, the endless white had cracked open to reveal something impossible. A warm valley untouched by snow, the ice receding like a curtain from a stage. This was supposed to be a mapping mission. Operation High Jump, 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft, was officially tasked with testing military equipment and establishing Antarctic bases. But even from the start, the scale of the operation raised eyebrows. Why send a fleet this large to map an uninhabited wasteland? According to Byrd's personal diary, found only years after his death, the answer lay in what they found, not what they expected. As his plane crossed into the ice-free zone, the instruments began to fail. Compasses spun. Radios crackled into silence. Then, emerging from the fog, stone structures, monolithic, mathematically aligned, and impossibly ancient, rose from the thawed ground. These weren't crude shelters. They were geometric, precise, and immense. Their seams so fine, mortar wasn't needed. Their surfaces bore inscriptions, glyphs and equations unfamiliar to any known script, yet somehow evocative of science, astronomy, and systems far beyond what we now consider ancient knowledge. The real astonishment came when Byrd's team discovered metallic devices embedded within the ruins, objects that emitted warmth, instruments with unknown materials, devices that, somehow, kept the valley temperate in a place where ice should reign eternal. The encounter didn't end with curiosity. Byrd's team was ordered back, their photographs vanished, their logs rewritten. The area was declared off-limits. Upon returning to the United States, Byrd gave interviews only about logistics, never once referencing what he'd described in his own hand. Was it a mistake to speak up, even in private? He spent the rest of his life under close scrutiny, his later years marked by silence and shadows. Today, satellite images show geometric anomalies buried beneath Antarctic ice, grids and angles in a land where randomness should rule. Yet expeditions to these regions are blocked by treaty. The area remains officially unremarkable. But if Byrd's account holds truth, if beneath the ice lies not just geology, but memory, then the implications stretch far beyond frozen soil. What would it mean for us to accept that civilization once thrived where now only cold survives? That beneath the South Pole silence lies a history unspoken, not of aliens or myths, but of humans who lived, built, dreamed, and were lost. In a world so sure of its progress, perhaps the greatest threat isn't what we find, but the reminder that we might not be the first to get this far, and perhaps not the last to fall. The Amazon is a green ocean of time, each tree a chronicle, each river a whisper. In 1925, Colonel Percy Fawcett set out to find a city he called simply Z. He wasn't chasing a myth. For years, Fawcett had studied centuries-old Portuguese accounts of vast urban centers deep within the jungle, cities with causeways, gardens, and metallurgical industries that dwarfed those of contemporary Europe. What he read didn't describe primitive villages, but civilizations, complex, organized, and intelligent. Fawcett believed the Amazon had once held something the modern world refused to see, because to admit it would require rewriting everything we thought we knew about indigenous history. So he left England, bringing only a small trusted team, including his son, Jack. They vanished. For decades, the expedition was dismissed as tragic folly. Rumors claimed they were killed by hostile tribes, starved, or lost in the vast green maze. But buried beneath that official story was another, one woven from dispatches smuggled out by indigenous messengers before communication abruptly stopped. Those final transmissions told of vast earthen mounds stretching for miles, ancient roads wide enough for armies, and soil, terra preta, engineered to retain fertility for centuries. They described tools made of alloys unknown to contemporary metallurgy, polished stone cities with water management systems, defensive walls, and plazas large enough to hold thousands. Then silence. Rescue missions were launched, but none returned with proof. Only fragments emerged, maps not drawn by Western hands, oral histories passed through generations of forest dwellers, and glimmers of what Fawcett may have touched before the jungle reclaimed him. Modern satellite imagery now confirms what Fawcett saw. Beneath the canopy lie geometric patterns, grids, circles, and causeways, impossible to form by chance. Lush ruins of something old, deliberate, and intelligent. And yet entry to many of these areas is now restricted, protected under the guise of preserving indigenous lands or biodiversity. What if it's more than that? Fawcett's journey wasn't only about discovery. It was about rebalancing the narrative. If the Amazon once held civilizations as advanced as those of Egypt or Mesopotamia, then the story of humanity is not east to west or north to south. It is everywhere, all at once. His disappearance remains an unsolved mystery, but perhaps that's the point. The jungle keeps its secrets, not out of malice, but because we haven't yet learned to ask the right questions. And when we do, the forest might answer, not with bones or ruins, but with a simple truth, that greatness once bloomed in places we chose not to look. In the wind-lashed heights of Tibet, where prayer flags snap against the void and time feels suspended between peaks, another kind of journey unfolded. In 1924, Russian explorer Nicholas Roerich wasn't seeking treasure or glory. His mission, officially, was cultural and artistic. But beneath that benign cover was something far more ambitious. A quest to find ancient manuscripts whispered about in monastic circles. Records said to contain knowledge from civilizations long vanished, and possibly from beyond our world. Roerich's team trekked through deserts, crossed mountain passes, and gained access to remote monasteries. In one such sanctuary, hidden among Himalayan cliffs, they found it, a library sealed for centuries. The scrolls were unlike anything they'd seen, written in scripts older than Sanskrit, filled with diagrams, equations, and star charts. With the help of resident monks, some were translated. What they revealed was astonishing. The texts spoke of energy fields, celestial alignments, and technologies capable of manipulating weather, healing the body, even flight. One scroll detailed a device resembling an anti-gravity platform, operating not through combustion or gears, but through vibration, sound, and what the monks called inner resonance. Roerich recorded meticulous notes, blueprints, symbols, astronomical calculations centuries ahead of their time. There were maps, too, of lands unknown, beneath polar ice and deserts, drawn with impossible precision. But the most haunting pieces were the prophecies. They spoke of a future shaped by machines, distant communication through air, and energy that could reshape the planet. Some predictions matched technologies developed only decades later. When Roerich returned to Soviet territory, he was not greeted with celebration. The manuscripts were seized. His team was questioned. For the rest of his life, he was shadowed, his writings censored, his discoveries dismissed as mysticism. But fragments survived, in notebooks smuggled west, in memories passed between students, in symbols carved into monastic walls, visible only to those who know where to look. Today, efforts to study these texts remain obstructed. Russian archives declare them classified. Tibetan access is barred by geopolitics. And yet, the stories persist. Why would a culture so isolated preserve knowledge so advanced? Unless they weren't isolated at all. Unless they were remembering, not inventing. If those scrolls are true, then the boundary between science and spirit, between past and future, is thinner than we imagine. The wisdom of the ancients wasn't forgotten. It was hidden, and perhaps waiting not to be decoded, but to be understood. The Gobi Desert stretches like a forgotten sea across Mongolia and northern China, vast, empty, and silent. But beneath its windswept dunes, one expedition claimed to hear echoes of something far older than sand. In 1922, American paleontologist Roy Chapman Andrews ventured into the Gobi in search of dinosaur fossils. His team expected bones and stones, remnants of creatures long dead. But what they uncovered defied not just paleontology, but history itself. Geologist Walter Granger, part of Andrews' team, documented the unearthing of metallic artifacts embedded in ancient rock strata, objects that predated known human civilization by millions of years, precision-machined components etched with geometric patterns and made of alloys unknown to contemporary science. These weren't tools of survival. They were instruments, measuring devices perhaps, calibrated with a delicacy that suggested advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and metallurgy. Deeper into the expedition, they stumbled upon something even more perplexing, a chamber carved into solid stone. Inside, remnants of what could only be described as a laboratory. Tables fused into the rock, shelves lined with fragments of glass and metal. Diagrams inscribed into the walls showing orbital paths, chemical formulas, and star charts not visible to the naked eye. Carbon dating later suggested the organic materials nearby were millions of years old, which posed an impossible question: who or what had built this place? Andrews recorded everything meticulously. He prepared to publish, but before he could, officials arrived, American, Mongolian, others unnamed. The site was sealed, the artifacts were removed, team members were sworn to silence. The expedition's end was attributed to political tensions, and its greatest find disappeared into classified obscurity. Later satellite imagery would reveal faint geometric patterns beneath the desert surface, grids and shapes too precise to be natural. But still, access was denied. The Gobi, it was said, held nothing more than dust. And yet, what if it holds a memory? If a civilization once flourished here before time as we count it, one capable of crafting metal, measuring the stars, and building to last epochs, what happened to them? Were they wiped out? Did they leave? Or did time simply close over them, like sand over stone? Maybe the desert didn't bury them. Maybe it preserved them, waiting for someone to listen, not with certainty, but with humility. Because sometimes the oldest places don't whisper, they wait. And when we're ready to ask the right questions, they answer. In the frozen north, where the horizon blurs into ice and sky, Canadian explorer Vilhjalmur Stefansson made a discovery in 1913 that would remain buried in silence for over a century. His expedition set out to chart the unclaimed Arctic, desolate, vast, inhospitable. Yet what Stefansson's team found shattered every expectation: ruins. Structures lay beneath the permafrost, shaped by hands long forgotten. They weren't the makeshift shelters of desperate nomads, but the engineered remnants of a people who understood cold, not as a challenge, but as a canvas. Walls angled to deflect wind, floors embedded with passive heating conduits, stairways carved into bedrock, still sharp despite centuries entombed in ice. And within these spaces, strange mechanisms, heaters with no trace of fire or fuel, devices humming faintly, as if still alive. The shock deepened with the discovery of instruments, delicate, ornate tools that mirrored sextants, compasses, even telescopic apparatus. These weren't symbolic artifacts. They were functional, precise, and disturbingly advanced. Among the ruins were charts, not of land, but of stars. Arctic sky maps etched in ice with astronomical precision. Some tracked planetary motion with such accuracy they exceeded what was known at the time. Others plotted long-term cycles, eclipses, equinoxes, precessions, measurements only possible with prolonged observation and sophisticated mathematics. The metallurgy confounded analysis. Knives still sharp, alloys impervious to corrosion. The ice, it seemed, had preserved both the artifacts and their enigma. When Stefansson relayed his findings to the Canadian authorities, he expected astonishment. Instead, he was met with silence. Then, restriction. His access was revoked. His funding dissolved. Future Arctic missions were confined to approved zones. The ruins were sealed under layers of official indifference. Why? Perhaps it was the implications. If Arctic civilizations existed and thrived, it would mean our understanding of geography, climate, and human adaptability had been fundamentally wrong. It would mean people once charted stars from a latitude we thought uninhabitable. And more deeply, it would suggest a cyclical truth, that climate, like memory, shifts, that what is ice today was once green, and that human ingenuity, like life, always finds a way. Modern climate shifts have begun to peel back those icy veils again. Structures emerge. But access remains restricted, wrapped in treaties and regulations. We are told it's to protect the environment. but perhaps it's also to protect a narrative, a fragile thread spun from the idea that we are the first to stand this tall. But if the Arctic has taught us anything, it's that silence can be louder than speech, and what we choose not to see may be the clearest reflection of who we really are. The Pacific Ocean is often imagined as empty, blue wilderness stretching horizon to horizon, but in 1947, a raft named Kon-Tiki crossed that vastness, and in doing so, stumbled upon a secret far older than any logbook. Thor Heyerdahl's goal was simple: to prove that ancient South Americans could have reached Polynesia using primitive seafaring. But what he found on the islands, and in the words of the people who welcomed him, was something else entirely. They spoke of ancestors who sailed not just between islands, but between continents, of ships that could read the stars and feel the current's pulse, of fireboats that moved underwater, of skyboats that flew before the wind. It sounded like mythology until the expedition found the artifacts. On remote shores stood megaliths aligned with solstices and equinoxes. Carvings hinted at engineering principles: shock absorption, seismic resistance, fluid dynamics. These weren't coincidences. They were designs born of knowledge. In one cave, Heyerdahl recorded diagrams etched in stone. They showed navigation techniques using stellar triangulation and spherical trigonometry, methods far more advanced than the tools available in the 1940s. On another island, rusted gears and mineral remnants suggested metallurgy and mining, long before Europeans set foot in the Pacific. But the most profound discovery was cultural. The oral histories weren't tales of isolation. They were maps, timelines, records of networks stretching across oceans, exchanges of goods, languages, even ideas. Heyerdahl returned to Europe with evidence, eager to share. But academic doors closed quickly. The Pacific, they said, was not a cradle of civilization. His findings were dismissed as speculation, his methods questioned, his motives doubted. Follow-up expeditions were denied funding. Islands were reclassified as ecologically sensitive or spiritually protected. The conversation was quietly closed. Yet beneath the waves, sonar reveals roads submerged, harbors long drowned. In labs, fragments of ancient tools whisper of ores not native to their find sites. Something moved across the Pacific. Something big. What if ancient maritime civilizations weren't just possible, but real? What if they built a world we forgot, a network of knowledge carried not on paper, but in memory, stone, and current? In dismissing the past, we may have also dismissed its greatest achievement, that people once knew how to cross the vastest distances, guided not by maps, but by the stars in their blood. And maybe, just maybe, the ocean remembers. In 1933, under the blistering sun of the Sahara, French archaeologist Henri Lotte led an expedition into the Tassili Niger, a plateau of stone forests and ancient silence. What he expected to find was prehistoric art. What he found instead was a window into a forgotten world. High on sandstone cliffs, beneath millennia of dust, were murals unlike any seen before. Towering figures with bulbous heads and elongated limbs, apparent machinery, suits that looked like pressure gear, and shapes resembling aircraft, winged, aerodynamic, purposeful. At first, they were interpreted symbolically, perhaps gods, perhaps rituals. But the deeper the team explored, the less metaphor made sense. The paintings were precise, technical, not abstract, but schematic, detailed enough to suggest familiarity with principles of aerodynamics, propulsion, even flight stability. Then came the ruins. Buried beneath dunes, Lotte's team uncovered remnants of a city, foundations laid in mathematical grids, walls designed to redirect floodwaters, irrigation systems that could have supported vast agriculture in a region now bone dry, metallurgical tools, chisels, crucibles, molds, crafted with skill that rivaled modern smiths. Among the artifacts were alloys that confounded analysis: harder than steel, lighter than aluminum, and engraved into stone were blueprints, diagrams of machines, turbines, and energy systems that did not match any known historical technology. But the moment these findings reached French colonial authorities, the narrative shifted. Reports were locked away. Access to the plateau was restricted. The expedition's most startling notes were confiscated, and Lotte was ordered to limit his publications to the artistic merit of the murals. Why the suppression? Some say the discoveries threatened more than archaeology. They challenged colonial ideology. To admit that ancient African civilizations had mastered advanced engineering and science would undermine the myth of European superiority. Today, satellite imagery shows buried urban grids beneath the sand, but permits to excavate remain elusive. What is left is only what survives in fragments, in copies of sketches, in testimonies of assistants, and in photos Lotte smuggled back to France. What if the Sahara was once not just green, but grand, a cradle of science, technology, and architecture, erased not by time, but by narrative? We often speak of the desert as empty, but perhaps that's the greatest illusion. The silence of the Sahara isn't absence, it's memory waiting to be uncovered. And if we listen closely, the sand still speaks. In 1938, deep in the Himalayas, a German expedition led by Ernst Schaefer arrived in Tibet under the guise of zoological research. What unfolded, however, was not a study of animals, but an encounter with mysteries that defied explanation and threatened to alter the very fabric of scientific understanding. The team gained access to ancient monasteries perched like watchtowers above the clouds. Inside, in chambers hidden from outsiders for centuries, they were shown objects and texts preserved with great reverence, devices that seemed to defy gravity, stone tablets etched with blueprints of machines powered by forces unknown to modern physics. There were orbs that hovered mid-air without support, metallic rods that hummed in response to touch. Most extraordinary were the demonstrations, monks focusing their attention, just attention, on a device that then moved, changed vibration, emitted light. Consciousness as energy, thought as force. Schaefer and his team documented it all. They took notes, photographs, and tracings of technical diagrams carved directly into stone walls. Equations that mirrored and sometimes surpassed the formulations of contemporary quantum theory. Back in Europe, the implications weren't lost on the Nazi regime. Rumors spread that Hitler sought these technologies for military advantage. Allied intelligence caught wind, and a quiet race began, clandestine operations sent into the mountains seeking to claim the ancient knowledge. But the monks knew what was coming. According to Tibetan oral accounts, many of the devices were dismantled, hidden, or destroyed. Not from fear, but principle. The technology, they believed, was not meant for conquest, but for harmony, healing, and balance between inner and outer worlds. In the years that followed, access to these sites became impossible. China's control of the region closed the mountains to outsiders. Schaefer's documents were scattered, many lost or classified. The few that remained speak in riddles, half-translations, symbolic schematics, fragments of something larger. If true, these discoveries suggest an ancient civilization that achieved what modern science only dreams of, a fusion of mind and matter, intention and machine. Not artificial intelligence, but conscious technology. And yet, instead of reverence, the response was secrecy, fear, suppression. Perhaps the greatest threat wasn't the power of the devices, but the paradigm they implied. That the universe responds not just to action, but awareness. That we shape the world not only with tools, but with thought. What would it mean to live in such a reality? Maybe the monks weren't guarding secrets. Maybe they were guarding us from what we're not yet ready to understand. The Australian outback is a place of extremes, ancient, arid, and filled with stories older than memory. In 1931, British archaeologist Grafton Elliot Smith ventured into this vast, red silence, expecting primitive rock art and oral traditions. What he discovered instead was a legacy of knowledge so advanced it threatened to unravel the assumptions of Western science. In sacred Aboriginal sites, Smith found carvings that mapped the stars with startling precision. Constellations, planetary alignments, lunar cycles, all encoded in a language of symbols and geometry, passed down through generations without pen or paper. Some sky maps reflected astronomical events visible only through telescopes, but it wasn't just the heavens that were charted. Rock engravings showed geological surveys, detailed diagrams of mineral veins, water aquifers, and fault lines, mapped with accuracy rivaling modern instruments. Smith's team confirmed these charts matched actual subterranean formations, identified through methods unknown to contemporary geologists. Even more astonishing were remnants of mining operations. Aboriginal guides led the expedition to ancient excavation sites where ore had been extracted with precision, smelted with chemical control, and fashioned into tools and ornaments using alloying techniques long thought to be beyond indigenous capabilities. Smith also observed sustainable agricultural systems engineered to work with Australia's brutal environment. These weren't just hunter-gatherers, they were land stewards using controlled burns, seasonal plant cycles, and environmental observation techniques grounded in a deep understanding of biology and chemistry. When Smith attempted to publish these findings, the backlash was swift. Colonial authorities suppressed his reports. Museums rejected the artifacts. Academic journals declined to review his work, branding it speculative. The idea that Aboriginal Australians possessed a sophisticated scientific legacy didn't fit the prevailing narrative, because to accept this truth would mean rewriting the story of who held knowledge and who was allowed to wield it. Today, fragments of that legacy survive in songs, rituals, and stone. But the most advanced discoveries, the ones that hinted at lost technologies and forgotten wisdom, remain locked away in government archives or restricted heritage zones. We are told this is to protect culture, but perhaps it also protects something else, the illusion that progress only moves in one direction. What if science wasn't always born in labs? What if it once rose from red earth, sung into stone by voices we refuse to hear? The outback is quiet, but not empty. Its silence holds equations, its wind carries memory, and its people, long denied their genius, may have once understood the land in ways we are only beginning to remember. In 1952, beneath the humid canopy of Palenque in southern Mexico, archaeologist Alberto Ruiz Luillier descended into a tomb and found something far more profound than royalty. The chamber he opened was the final resting place of Pakal the Great, a Mayan ruler whose legacy was etched not just in stone, but in science. At first glance, it was a marvel of art and ritual, intricate glyphs, majestic sarcophagi, walls speaking of gods, journeys, and the afterlife. But among the ceremonial carvings were strange depictions of devices, mechanisms, and patterns that resembled machines more than mythology. Then came the artifacts. Within sealed compartments, Ruiz's team discovered objects that did not conform to ceremonial norms. Components that looked machined, cog-like forms, symmetrical metal plates, carved crystalline elements with optical properties, materials that resisted corrosion, responding to tests in ways unexplained by contemporary metallurgy. Most confounding was a structure resembling an ancient computational device, gears interlocked with mathematical precision, engravings suggesting planetary calculations, eclipse tracking, and orbital modeling. Ruiz documented his findings. He photographed, sketched, and theorized. But as word of the technological implications spread, the tone shifted. Government officials arrived. Access to certain chambers was restricted. Key artifacts disappeared into private archives. Foreign researchers were quietly denied permits. The site, once open to scholarly inquiry, became tightly controlled, Officially, the narrative returned to mythology. The astronaut imagery was dismissed as misinterpretation. The mechanisms were labeled ceremonial. The energy systems, rumored to still emit faint heat, were written off as coincidence. Yet whispers remained. Among the Mayan glyphs were references to the stars not just as symbols, but as destinations. Cycles of time tied to celestial rhythms. Descriptions of forces, solar, magnetic, gravitational, used not in poetry, but in design. What if the Maya weren't just astronomers, but engineers? What if Pakal's tomb wasn't a memorial, but a vault, preserving not just his body, but his people's most advanced knowledge? Modern archaeology continues to unveil Mayan brilliance, but avoids the frontier where science and spirituality overlap. Because to follow that thread would mean confronting a possibility we're not ready for, that an indigenous American civilization may have understood physics in ways we still don't fully grasp. Sometimes we lock the past away not to protect it, but to protect ourselves, from the humility of realizing that our ancestors, far from primitive, may have seen further than we dare to look. And in the humid silence of Palenque, their voice still waits, in gears, in stone, in stars. By the time we reach the 12th account, a pattern begins to emerge, not of isolated anomalies, but of something deeper. A silence maintained across borders, regimes, and decades. These weren't tales of wild speculation. They were field notes, diaries, blueprints, eyewitness accounts. The pattern wasn't in the discoveries. It was in what followed them. Each expedition we've revisited, whether in Antarctica or the Amazon, the Himalayas, or the Sahara, culminated not in fame, but in erasure. Reports rewritten, teams disbanded, sites sealed, funding withdrawn, artifacts disappeared. Sometimes the suppression was bureaucratic, other times forceful. But always the result was the same. The discovery never reached the world. Why? To answer that, we must shift our gaze, not to the lost, but to the keepers of memory, the institutions that curate what is known, the governments that guard what is hidden, the cultures that, when faced with truth that doesn't fit the framework, choose to bury it rather than rewrite the frame. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's fear. Not of the past, but of what it implies. If advanced civilizations existed before ours, it challenges the myth of linear progress. If indigenous peoples mastered sciences we're only now rediscovering, it upends colonial narratives. If human history is punctuated by forgotten cycles of brilliance and collapse, then we are not the pinnacle, but the continuation of something fragile. These expeditions, 10 lost, now found in fragments, speak not of aliens or fantasy, but of human potential, of knowledge earned and lost, of civilizations that may have chosen not to build higher, but deeper, not louder, but wiser, and of the quiet tragedy that we've inherited only pieces. Somewhere, these stories still exist in full, in archives marked classified, in desert vaults, in monastic memory, in oral traditions dismissed as myth. The great question is not whether these things were real. The question is, why do we refuse to look? Perhaps the answer lies not in science, but in identity. We are a species that builds meaning through continuity. To question the past is to unsettle the present. To admit we've forgotten is to admit we've been wrong. But maybe that's the beginning of wisdom. And maybe the true legacy of these lost expeditions is not what they found, but what they remind us. That history is not fixed, that knowledge can be buried, that silence is not absence, and that the map of what we know still holds blank spaces, spaces that call to us, softly, insistently, across the distance of time. It always ends with disappearance. A plane vanishes over ice, a camp abandoned in the jungle, a final journal entry never followed. 10 expeditions, each beginning in curiosity and ending in silence. But the silence itself speaks, not of failure, but of fear, not of myths, but of truths deemed too large. If these stories shared only wonder, they might have been celebrated. But they share disruption. They suggest that human history is not a straight line, but a tapestry, woven, torn, rewoven again. Civilizations rising not once, but many times. Knowledge lost, not for lack of intelligence, but for reasons more deliberate. Power, after all, is not just about what is known. It's about who gets to decide what is real. Imagine a world where Arctic hunters mastered thermal engineering before the Industrial Age, where Aboriginal astronomers mapped the sky in ways rivaling modern satellites, where Maya engineers harnessed energy systems still not understood, where oceanic navigators traded knowledge across continents millennia before Columbus, where monasteries preserved the mechanics of thought-powered machines and chose not to share them. To accept these possibilities is to accept that modern civilization is not the first to touch the stars. So instead, we turn away. We build walls around mystery. We wrap discovery in red tape. We call wisdom superstition. We label explorers as eccentrics, and we hide the greatest questions behind a curtain labeled myth. But myths are mirrors. They reflect not only what was, but what might be again. Across these accounts, a deeper message surfaces, one that echoes from the stones of Palenque, the sands of the Sahara, the glaciers of Antarctica. Humanity is older than we think, smarter than we admit, more fragile than we're willing to believe. What then do we do with this knowledge? Do we chase it? Dig it up? Demand the keys to secrets once suppressed? Or do we listen to the rhythm beneath the facts, the humility beneath the wonder? Maybe the greatest discovery isn't in the artifacts, but in the awareness they awaken, that we are part of something vast, that we are not the first. And that survival, true survival, may depend not on our power to conquer, but on our willingness to remember. Because history doesn't disappear. It waits, and those who dare to find what they shouldn't may just find who we were meant to be. So we return full circle, not to a conclusion, but to a question. What happens when the past is deeper than we imagined? When the silence of deserts, jungles, ice fields, and mountain temples hides not emptiness, but evidence? When the story of who we are is no longer linear, but layered, folded into itself like sediment, waiting to be read anew? These 14 stories are not isolated wonders. They are echoes, fragments of a forgotten continuity. Not proof of myth, but possibility. They ask us not to believe, but to wonder, to peer past the curtain drawn by time, politics, and pride. The Antarctic city, the Amazon's hidden roads, Tibetan scrolls that speak in the language of stars, machines etched in Mayan stone, Aboriginal maps that align with distant planets. Each whispers the same truth. We've been here before, not with the same names or faces, not with smartphones or satellites, but with minds just as bright, with eyes turned to the same sky, with questions that transcended their age. What destroyed them? Climate? Conflict? Hubris? Or was it simply the forgetting, the slow erosion of memory under the weight of survival? In burying their legacies, we didn't just lose knowledge, we lost continuity, and perhaps, most of all, humility. Because to accept that others before us reached similar heights, or even greater ones, is to accept that progress isn't inevitable, that intelligence is not exclusive to the present, that we are not alone, not in the universe perhaps, but in time. This isn't a call to conspiracy. It's a call to curiosity. A reminder that science, when unshackled from dogma, is not afraid to look backward as well as forward. That wisdom may live in stone as much as in silicon. That the greatest discoveries may lie not ahead, but beneath our feet. The explorers we followed didn't find monsters or myths. They found mirrors reflecting what we could become or what we once were. And now the responsibility falls to us. To listen without agenda, to investigate without fear, to restore what was lost, not only in records, but in reverence. Because in the end, this is not a story about hidden cities or suppressed artifacts. It is a story about humanity, about the timeless drive to understand, about the cost of forgetting, and the wonder of remembering. What else lies waiting? Not beyond the stars, but within our own forgotten chapters. Maybe the next expedition isn't out there. Maybe it begins with a single, simple act: to ask again.